Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bipin Kumar. I work as project coordinator at CSPC. Welcome to the first CSPC virtual panel of 2026. It's my pleasure to see such a strong turnout as we begin the new year of important conversations at the intersection of science, policy, and society. To start off, we are diving into a topic that sits at the very heart of our ecosystem towards a new science culture framework in Canada. Uh, to lead this important conversation, I am honored to introduce our moderator for today, Tracy Ross. Tracy is the Vice President of Network Membership at Actua, where she brings extensive leadership in STEM outreach and deep commitment to breaking down barriers in science engagement. We are in excellent hands. Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bipin. Welcome, everyone. I excited to be here today. Kicking things off, I would like to ensure that we're hoping to know who's in the room today. I understand we have a lot of folks sign up, and I'm really excited about that. So just to help us tailor this conversation and future ones, we are launching a quick demographic poll by CSPC. This is entirely demographic and entirely anonymous and voluntary, of course, but it helps us understand the diverse perspectives represented in the room. We'll keep that open for about a minute while I get us settled, and you can take a moment to fill that out now. You should see it on screen. As Bipin said, we're here to discuss a really important shift towards a new, potentially, science culture framework in Canada. I am Tracy Ross with Actua, and Actua is one of Canada's leading STEM outreach organizations. We work with a network of programs at post-secondary institutions across the country to engage youth in STEM in a wide variety of programs, from summer programs to school programs, out of school events, and more. At Actua, we see firsthand how science and culture impacts youth across the country. This is particularly relevant in today's world in so many ways. But as we all consider Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen's imminent, maybe a little less imminent with today's news of the postponement, his trip to the moon on Artemis 2 mission, that's a great example how we all will individually and collectively experience that trip, how we feel about science and technology once it's done. It's a really prominent example of science and culture. But it's by no means the only one. We know from health, to tech, to climate and energy, we aren't just talking about today's science and society. We're actually talking about the future of how Canada engages with discovery and innovation. So here's the results of the poll. Love to see that there's a great mix of nonprofit, private, government, academia, and other. We've got a strong contingent from Central Canada, but also West Coast, Prairie, Atlantic. No one yet from the Northern Territories, but I hope they'll join soon. And even outside of Canada, that's great. We also have folks in executive roles, senior management, staff, scientists, students, and other. So that's great. We're excited to have you all here. Thank you for joining. Just quickly, I'm going to share a land acknowledgement for myself and for you all. I am joining here today from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations of people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I hope everyone can just take a moment to think of the land and waters that you're joining us from today and hold our conversations with a commitment to honoring the power of observation and interconnectedness of nature and relationships that Indigenous cultures and communities bring to the understanding of the natural world. One more mention. Before we go into the panel, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the recent and profound loss to our science community. The Honorable Kirsty Duncan was a tireless champion for everyone in science engagement, and she was such a fierce advocate for a more inclusive science culture. So I hope our conversation today honors that and honors her legacy by continuing something that she was so passionate about, ensuring that everyone in Canada has a chance to participate and benefit from science. We know this is an incredibly important topic in this context, but we know it's complex as well. So I'm really excited to have the panel here today. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We will be taking questions throughout through the Q&A feature in the Zoom link. In the bottom panel, there's a specific Q&A feature. Please preserve the chat line for general comments or troubleshooting questions to the panelists. And if you would like to upvote a question, the Q&A feature has that as well. So instead of repeating questions, just click on upvote and we'll get it on this end. So now I'm going to move to introductions. I have so many. One more housekeeping. There is a recording. This session is being recorded. And after this session, those who registered, if you're not able to save for the whole thing or not at all, that's completely fine. You'll get the recording afterwards. So now I am ready to do panelist introductions. First off, we have Dr. Marianne Mader, the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Science Centres, which has the aim of building a thriving science and innovation culture right in the mission of the organization, which is great. With 10 million annual visitors to the member network, you bring perspective of large-scale public engagement and science literacy campaigns like Together Against Misinformation, Science Literacy Week, and Science Up First. Thanks for coming here, Marianne. Next is Desiree Sylvester, who is Director of Education at Visions of Science, leads national and local initiatives focused on advancing STEM equity, supporting educators and organizations to move beyond one-size-fits-all approaches, which is so important in any science culture framework. Desiree is also pursuing a PhD at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Desiree. Dr. Dan Monroe, who as Actua's research director and fellow of the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Dan is both embedded in the world of evaluating the impact of STEM programs, as well as examining broader social, technological, and economic challenges facing Canada. And Dan has been the driver behind some recent discussion papers published by Actua that are relevant to this topic that we'll be talking about today. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Tracy.
Susie Loney is also here, research director of the Council of Canadian Academies. Susie oversees the research practices and supports the development of new assessment projects for the Council of Canadian Academies. During her time at CCA, Susie has contributed as a researcher and writer to many assessments, including incentivizing antimicrobial availability, disaster resilience in a changing climate, and very important to this conversation, the state of Canada's science culture. Thank you, Susie. So happy to have you here. So let's get started. We are moving right along, and I want to give everyone a chance to kind of help us set the context. Why are we doing this? Why do we need a framework, and why now? So I'll just ask everyone to answer from their vantage point, give you a couple of minutes each, starting with Marianne. Maybe you can tell us from the scale at which you're looking at programs, what does a science culture framework do for you?
Thanks. And thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to kind of in the audience. So I'm going to bring maybe a really, really high level view to this conversation. I had the privilege of sitting on the G7 Science Communication Working Group recently as a Canadian expert. And when you start thinking at a national and international level, like why would you need a science culture framework? It's really necessary if we want to address global challenges. And particularly conversations that were centered in that conversation is what's going to happen when there's another global emergency? How can we be ready? How can we build resiliency in advance of? And one of those keys is to think about your science culture. And our view on that is through an ecosystem lens and kind of the health of connectivity of the organizations and sectors that make up that culture. So that's why I think having a framework is critical, because you can't really understand the whole thing unless you have this framework.
Yeah, getting our hands around it, and then also resiliency to challenges up ahead. It makes total sense. Desiree, Visions of Science is so connected to the communities you work at, but you also have a very strong national and national advocacy role. From where you sit, is a framework useful? Is it just more paperwork, bureaucratic exercise? What would it do for you?
Again, also, thank you, Tracy. Really, really excited to be here. And I'll talk about this maybe more so from a local or community-based perspective. So, from, where I sit at Visions of Science, working in under-resourced, equity-deserving communities for more than 15 years, a science culture framework feels very, very urgent for three reasons that I will just quickly highlight. So first, the relationship, right, between science and the many of the communities we work with it's very complex and fragile, right? And so we know what happened in the pandemic. We saw that it really exposed the long histories of inequities that happens in healthcare, in our education, and in our environment. And today we have these young people, right, and their families are often holding this sort of curiosity and skepticism at the same time. And so they're asking these really thoughtful questions, right? They want good information. And at the same time, they remember these systems have not served them well. So I think a framework really helps us name, right, that reality honestly. And instead of assuming that there is a single neutral, like public that seems that needs to be convinced. Secondly, right, most of our tools for thinking about science culture are still very individual and very short term, right? And so we tend to ask questions like, does this young person like science, or do they know certain facts about XYZ, right? Did they attend a certain program, right? At Visions of Science, we see that every day what really shapes, right, a young person's relationship with science is really the context around them, right? So their school, their family, their housing situation, right? The experiences with healthcare and public institutions, and whether they see themselves in the positions of scientific authority. So without a framework that takes those wider conditions really seriously, we are risking putting all the responsibility on these individual kids to be more resilient or more interested rather than asking what needs to change and in the systems that they are navigating. And thirdly, I will also say having this a framework and specifically having a framework around science culture, specifically having a shared equity-centered framework that I would propose. If we don't have this, it's very hard, right, to align our efforts. A lot of great work is happening right across Canada in terms of networks, investments, organizations, but they are unevenly distributed and we don't have a common language, right, for what we are actually trying to do. So for example, just very quickly at Visions, we are interested not only in whether youth enjoy STEM, but whether they experience, right, belonging, trust, agency. Can they see themselves, right, in science? Do they trust who is speaking on their behalf? And do they feel that they can use science to solve, problems that matter to them? So for me, we need a science culture framework now, right?
Mhm.
We need to move beyond counting activities and participants towards having a shared understanding that includes equity, belonging, and community power as core dimensions.
Wow, that is some very strong arguments for a science culture framework now, Desiree. Thank you so much for laying that out, getting us started. Susie, if you're there, I mean, you were part of putting forward a framework in the paper that we will talk about shortly. Is it still necessary? What does it do for you? Tell us your thoughts on opening up this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm gonna just add to what has already been said. I think science culture means different things for different people, and that was one of the first sort of challenges we had with this project way back in 2012. What is science culture? So having even just that level of kind of common understanding is really helpful. I mean, for me, this is essentially around kind of our understanding of science, our attitudes about science, and our engagement with it. But when I'm sort of this process forces us to think back about what we did then and clearly science culture is very fluid. It's not static, and the way that society engages with science matters profoundly. It shapes so many of the different kinds of decisions we make, from what we eat to how we manage our health, how we vote. So we do need to revisit what we mean, and then, what do we want in terms of a science culture for Canada, and are we achieving that? How are we performing against those goals? And just so much has changed in the last few years with generative AI, with the pandemic. We might have our ideas and assumptions about how our science, where we sort of stand today, where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are, but there's just so much we don't know right now. And so coming up with that framework really helps us figure out what do we understand and what don't we understand, and where do we need to go from there. So I'll just maybe leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's great. I'm hearing a lot of consistency in the answers, but Dan, if you're there, what do you see? We've had a lot of folks talk about the need for getting our arms around what are the pieces of science culture, and kind of looking at the measures. What does that mean to you? What do you, having sort of thought about this recently, what does a science culture framework do from your perspective?
Yeah, well, so there are two reasons that stand out for me, that have sort of different starting places. One is that, like, we know that a strong science culture is associated with a lot of good stuff, right? Things like better innovation and prosperity, better health and well-being, stronger community resilience. So on the one hand, we always want to be talking about what science culture is and thinking about it in a systematic, frameworked way so that we can, design better policies and programs to get to those good things. So we want to do that systematically. Framework helps with that. Secondly, the other sort of reason that stands out for me is that, and this echoes, much of what Desiree says, our understanding of who gets to participate in and who benefits from science has really evolved over the last 10 or 20 years. But those sorts of insights, those changes are not well reflected in our thinking about science culture, not well reflected in our frameworks. So there's a need, and I think an opportunity to bring those science culture frameworks more in line with our understanding of what science culture is and what it ought to be, so that everybody can share in those good things through science culture, that innovation, prosperity, health and well-being, and stronger communities.
Well, that's actually a great lead in. Thank you, Dan, to our next area where all of us have thoughts on how we'd like to change things, but let's talk about what do we actually know now about science culture? Where are we starting from? Susie, maybe I'll ask you, because if you, as a big part of the original paper, could you maybe walk us through how the 4 different dimensions of science culture that the paper from 2014 described, and what the assessment group landed on? And while you're getting started on that, I'll put a link to the paper in the chat. So if people want to go to it directly and download it, for future reading, they can do that.
Sure, happy to do that. This was actually the first project that I worked on when I joined the CCA back in 2012. So it's fun to get to revisit it. I think that one of the really important contributions of that work was this set of quantitative measurements around the state of science culture in Canada. So this was primarily informed by a survey that was conducted of around 2,000 people in Canada, and it collected data relating to 4 different dimensions of science culture. So that's knowledge, attitudes, engagement, and skills. And the survey questions, we didn't invent them. We used questions that have been being asked across countries and across time for a long time now, so that we could track what was changing in Canada since the last survey, which had actually been done in 1989, and also across countries, see how Canada sort of compared internationally. And just to kind of address one of the points Desiree introduced, this was very much focused at an individual level. This survey was just like on an individual basis. How are different Canadians engaging and perceiving science? So generally speaking, relative to the other countries we compared to, who had collected this information, we performed very well in terms of engagement and knowledge, and sort of more middle of the road, fine in terms of attitudes and skills. Bottom line, in 2013, Canada was doing well by this conception of science culture. So just maybe to go through that in a little bit more detail, when it came to engagement, we saw that 93% of the respondents were interested in understanding and following new scientific discoveries and technological developments. And when this was the highest result of any of the 33 countries we compared with. And then when we asked about engagement by visiting science centers and museums, 32% of the population reported to have done so in the last year. That was second highest results out of the 33 countries. And then when it came to knowledge-based science literacy, we were at the top across all these countries, the strongest scores by some margin at that time. However, even still, by this science literacy index, it suggests that more than half of people in Canada probably lacked the kind of scientific understanding that would be needed to make sense of a science story in a mainstream news publication. So we also saw, we were able to look at some variation across groups in that. We were able to look at results separately for men and women, and some regional analysis. We would have needed a larger sample size to go all that much further in terms of understanding differences between groups. And then just to finish up, when it came to attitudes, just kind of an average series here for our sense of the promise of science, but very little reservations about science in Canada compared to other countries. And I would be really curious to know where that stands today, because it doesn't totally sit with my sense of where things are at. Skills-wise, we found that about 20% of university grads were coming out of natural science and engineering programs, which was 19th out of 29 countries. So not as strong there.
So that would be something to update as well. That's super interesting, and thank you. I'm sure folks have a lot to follow up on that. I think you mentioned things right off the top that you were seeing that in an update, things that have changed, or that you would like to see more kind of collective measures. This one being a very individual measure, but it was super interesting that the test before that was, or the study before that, which was a bit unusual, right? CCA had not done this kind of a survey of like direct research, usually in assessments before. And the one before that had been in 1989. So, this is it's not a regular kind of thing that we had. And we know we still don't either. So that's super helpful. Thank you. And it is a great starting point for sure, in terms of how to think about science culture in Canada. Well, maybe I will move to Desiree, some of your thoughts on this. Since it relates well to the questions that we were talking about before. How do you think about science culture at Visions of Science? You unpacked that a little bit at the beginning. Do you want to dig into it a little bit more? But, are there concepts from this list here that you would add, or that you would change, or other things that you would add?
Yeah, I'll start with how we think about, science culture at Visions of Science.
Sure.
More specifically, and then maybe move over. So we think about science culture, right, as how science actually shows up in the everyday lives of young people, right? And in young people, in their families, in the communities, and in the communities we serve, and how that experience is shaped by history, by identity, and by power. So because at Visions of Science, the communities we work with are primarily in under-resourced contexts, equity deserving communities, science culture for us, as I said, isn't just, do you like science, or can you answer this, as I said earlier, but it has to include questions like, do I see people like me involved in science and decision-making roles? Given my community's experience with healthcare, with education, the environment, do we have a reason to trust, right? And do we have meaningful opportunities to use science to address issues that, that matter in our neighborhoods, right? From health and housing to climate and technology. So in practice, this raises very, I would say, specific questions for us, right? So questions like, what does it mean to talk about science in neighborhoods where families' experiences of the healthcare system are marked by these long wait times, right? Or being dismissed? How do you invite young people to see themselves in research when their families have experienced surveillance or over policing, right? So these are the realities that sit in the room with us, like when we run a STEM program, and they are a big part of what science culture actually looks like, right, in our communities. So practically speaking, that's why our work has evolved. So primarily pre-pandemic, we were mainly a Saturday STEM clubs program, right? That supported youth right from grade 3 to grade 8, right? And we've had to shift to a deeper, more longer term STEM learning pathways, right? And that starts from grade 3 all the way to age 25. And we work very closely with families, schools, and local organizations. And so that what we've learned is that you don't shift science culture through one-off workshops or outreach, right? You shift, right, it through this long-term presence. So through trusted relationships and youth being able to have many different entry points for themselves and for their caregivers to engage with science in their own terms. So in terms of what I would add or in how we usually talk about science culture is these three concepts. And I know that Susie, you talked a little bit, about it, but specifically I would add belonging, right? So do you feel you have a legitimate place, right, in these spaces, right? Do you feel safe and seen? In regards to agency, right, and agency and community voice. So can young people, right, and the communities question, shape, and apply scientific knowledge, or are they positioned mainly as recipients, right, of messages?
Yeah.
And then finally, on the local level, right, thinking about local or community-centered power, we have national narratives about science culture. They can look strong, right? While the specific neighborhoods have very thin and fragmented or these short-term opportunities. So I'm very aligned with the broader concepts that we've been discussing. But I would say from visions of science perspective, I would want, and Susie, to echo what you said, or I think it's Tracy, I'd want any frameworks we develop to build equity, right, belonging and community power in the center, so that when we ask, how are we doing on science culture? What we're really asking is, how are we doing for the communities who have historically been furthest from this opportunity?
Thanks. That's really powerful and actually provides some very concrete additions to or reframing, of the science culture framework that we were looking at before, and offers a new approach. Sense of belonging is super important, and it's something with STEM identity that I think folks may be hearing about more, and I think it's a really valuable contribution to dig into and think about more in this work. Dan, maybe I could move to your comments and ask you a little bit more about what ACTUA has been thinking about. And having developed for our work within ACTUA a definition or a provisional definition, let's say, of science culture that builds on Council of Canadian Academies and others. What aspects does ACTUA's working definition bring into the conversation that we may not have already talked about here?
Yeah. So let me build up to the definition itself in maybe 3 or 4 quick stages.
You're not just going to give me the answer right now?
I'm not just going to hand you the definition. I'm going to build it up, right?
Thank you.
And you know this about me, Tracy, because when ACTUA asked my team to put together a discussion paper on science culture, I came back a week later and said, can I do 3? instead of one. So that's why there's 3 papers, because it's such a big topic. But so a couple of points to make before I give you the definition. One is that I just want to reinforce that I think the CCA framework, it provides a really strong foundation, right? That whatever else we add to a science culture framework, I think that needs to be part of it. I mean, it's important to know, what the aggregate levels of, individual attitudes, engagement, knowledge, and skills are, because those are the things that help us understand how you get to the outcomes that we want, the sort of the big innovation, prosperity, health outcomes. So that's one point. I would add 3 things. And one of these, actually, again, I'm not even sure you need me here because I keep echoing what Desiree says, right? The first thing is I think we need to add a distributional lens to a science culture framework, right? We could call it an equity lens or belonging lens, right? I mean, we want to know not only how individual capacity looks in the aggregate, we want to know how opportunities to participate in science, benefit from science are distributed by, for example, gender identity, racial identity, indigenous identity, socioeconomic circumstances, geography, all of these things, right? We want to know not just what is in society, we want to know who has those, skills, attitudes, behaviors, and opportunities, right? Secondly, I think we want to add a systems or structural lens to the conversation, right? So we want to know how different institutions, organizations, norms, resources, behaviors, how all of these things, all of these structures or systems, or whatever you want to call them, how they shape the development of science culture on the one hand, and we want to know how those structures shape and constrain that distribution of opportunities to participate and benefit from science. Do the systems include or exclude, right? So we want to measure sort of systems health or structural features. And then the third thing I'd add is what I call a participatory or democratic lens, right? So, I mean, the relationship between science and society has changed a lot over the last 10, 20 years, something I sort of mentioned at the outset. But we have not yet settled on a really good or clear vision of what that relationship should be now. But I do think there's some pretty good evidence that democratic engagement is critical. So, we want to ask things like, do people have opportunities to share their views and values and knowledge and experience in and about science and technology? And we want to ask, are people empowered to help shape the priorities, direction, and pace of science and technology in society, right? I mean, I always think science is important, but for me and for others, it's intrinsically important. That is, it serves other larger goals. So we want to know, how that relationship happens. Okay. And I haven't committed this to memory yet, Tracy, so I'm actually going to have to read this, but I'll read it with my sort of lecturing, slow, emphatic voice. But so we've settled on this sort of provisional definition that captures some of this stuff. And it's in the first of the 3 papers on page 14 for those following along. But here's essentially what it says. And this is entirely for discussion. This is just something, that we're laying out for discussion. So we say that a strong science culture values diverse norms, attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge systems, that it equips people with basic and advanced skills in order to practice constant inquiry, engage in public dialogue on science, to support evidence-informed decision-making, and to champion discovery and responsible innovation. So that's a lot. I'll be quiet now. But those are the things that I think we're talking about adding to a science culture framework.
It's really helpful. It is a big list, and it's a lot to get. I feel daunted as someone who would like to participate in science culture in that way. However, and I love this stuff, but it does show how science is not an other thing. Science is part of culture. Science is in culture. Science is something that we are all, every single one of us, engaging with one way or another every single day, almost all the time. So it is a big topic and super relevant. We've put our hat in the ring with a a definition or something to talk about. And Dan, if you get a chance, you could even put it in the chat and for people to look at, and we'll ask CSPC to share it. And then I have also put in the chat, but I might need CSPC to reshare them, the links to the papers on the ACTUA website. The first paper on reimagining science culture, second paper on systemic change in STEM, and the third on measuring science culture, which is the direction we're going to talk about next. And these are all just discussion papers. They are out there for discussion with the community here. So Marianne, you know, you've been very patient here, but I think you're excited. I think you're probably excited about what we're talking about. And CASC, as well as ACTUA, as well as our individual programs, we all act as the connective tissue in these ecosystems. I know you think about that a lot. I wonder if you could share a bit of your thinking coming back to what we were talking about before in terms of that connective tissue that organizations thinking about science culture a lot can offer to this work.
Yeah, thanks. Thinking about connective tissue in terms of, you know, what came out of that original CCA report, I think is really important. And maybe I'm going to build on what Dan and Desiree added. So Dan, when you were talking about your second dimension around structures and systems as a way to think around science culture, in the 2014 report, I think it listed, you know, 900 informal science organizations. And it kind of did this kind of survey of it, didn't really go beyond that. And I think the build on thinking about organization system is, what is the relationship? What is the relationships between these organizations and between the other sectors within a science culture? So, you know, our organization represents many science centers and STEM outreach organizations, you know, science public engagement, informal science learning, that's kind of a sector. But then within science culture, you have research, you know, you have government, you've kind of media, these other elements. And so I think a framework could address the connectivity across organizations and sectors. So the work that we're doing at CASC and the research that we're the path we're on is taking a systems thinking lens to understanding science culture. So we're going to be embarking on systems mapping exercise, which is essentially it creates a model, you know, of what science culture might be, and it's really designed to reveal the underlying interrelationships and structure of a complex system. This is inherently complex. There's a lot of moving parts. And ultimately, after mapping, we want to understand what are some key leverage points where we can influence change to have the biggest impact towards what we're working towards. So many of our organizations have been focused around STEM equity, around addressing truth and reconciliation, the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science with Western science. So we're looking at identifying leverage points through this kind of system lens, and then ultimately the co-creation of solutions. And Desiree, this is where I wanted to build on what you were saying. The way that you're doing the work is interconnected. It's with multiple organizations. And so it'd be interesting to kind of look at partnerships as part of this, co-creation as kind of mandatory when we're thinking about science culture. So kind of inherent in our kind of the way we're working towards science culture is a more of a collective impact approach. So it's not just looking at individual organizations and their success, but together, how are we identifying kind of common challenges, and how do we have shared measurement in addressing that, reinforcing activities, communication. We now foster a lot of communities of practice for that reason. And we're essentially this kind of dedicated background organization that's helping towards collective impact. that we don't necessarily drive. The network is driving. If I have time, I was going to give one example of what this kind of a system change functionally can look
Go ahead.
like.
Yep,
Yeah,
we're good.
okay. So we're now in the work when we're designing programs, it's kind of through this like systems innovation lens. And so we're really looking at shifting structures like within our sector. So it's not just about individual outcomes, but it's like, how can we start shifting structures and mindsets? So one program that is just about to launch is Nagana Minagozawin, which translates into we give these gifts to the future, and it's an accelerator program. And the core vision of this accelerator program is a collective learning journey to support, members of our network as they grow relationships with local Indigenous communities, and they engage more deeply in these knowledge systems. And this is it's led by Dr. Melanie Goodchild, so Anishinaabe Systems Change Scholar, Wolf Willow Institute, Presence Institute. Like it's a rich program where there's cohorts of at least kind of 4 people from each organization, and they're on a journey for 2 years. And we're trying to take this like, a certain percentage, 30% of a kind of a network sector kind of can have this bit of a mind shift, and they're doing it together. So that's the kind of design we're thinking about. So then when they get to a point of creating new programs, it's in this a supportive environment, and it can be in a co-creation capacity as well.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that example. That's super helpful. And it is, again, the kind of thing that is, it gets bigger and bigger, but I think the system change thinking is super important, and we can not get too daunted because it is manageable. Just, what is it they say about eating an elephant? Small pieces. Yes. So we can do this. We can definitely do this. We're moving next to thinking about measurement. Everyone's kind of mentioned, how do we kind of capture this and get things that can give us indicators or measures of this. We've relied a lot on metrics in the past, or measures of folks' attitudes, thinking about prior studies. But I wonder if I could go back to you, Marianne, and think about that. Just carrying on with some of the thinking around measures or indicators or ways that we could capture the outcomes that we're looking at, but also that in between that you're kind of talking about.
Well, and I think, we think about measurements now, like the outcomes at the individual level, which is really important. I think we can kind of open the hatch a bit and measure some of the process to get there and to understand the process. Because if we kind of measure these outcomes without actually understanding this kind of messy bit, it might not be designing the most effective solutions. So I think some KPIs or measurements that could be added is understanding the health at an ecosystem level. So this could be strengths of relationships. It could be measuring collaboration, co-creation, partnerships, shared spaces of dialogue as a key aspect of a healthy science culture. So there's more of this kind of community aspect to science culture that is also measured, not just the results on an individual. So right now we often measure, for example, youth engagement, an individual, and we don't measure the influence of that experience on their family, on their community. Like everything is kind of a ripple effect, and science culture in itself is more comprehensive than the individual. What this could look like when we think about measurements at an individual scale. So we talked about skills, and but it could be like people know where to look for information, or they feel like they have trusted people in their lives to turn to for this information, or they would know where to be directed to. So this idea of interconnectivity across organizations, it's like cross referral. Libraries are like, oh, hey, you might want to check out this, and science centers, oh, you may want to check out this, and it's that interconnectivity. Because Desiree was mentioning, how can we ensure there's many entry points for someone? And so that, I think that strength and interconnectivity is key to that. Could be thinking about measuring, like assessing if people can address misinformation and tease out, what's true and what's not. And there's a lot of parts to that, and trust building is key. We've been doing a kind of analysis of our network in terms of KPIs that are measured by science centers and emerging ones. And an emerging KPI is audience trust. And so I think that's something we're going to see, and it's something that could be added into this framework.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And I agree with that. I just want to mention a couple of notes here. We've got some juicy questions coming into the Q&A tool. So take a look at those. I'm going to have a tough time choosing when we get to those answers. And I also want to acknowledge that we have had a couple of comments come in through the chat mechanism, reference to the Canada Foundation for Innovation in partnership with ACTFAS, worked with a polling firm Ipsos to shed light on the attitudes of 18 to 24-year-old Canadians towards the science and science and the conditions and the people who shape them in 2021. So I definitely, and the link is there in the comments. And speaking to some of the attitudes and findings from talking to youth, and that was a super valuable addition. I think there was a prior study as well, and super interesting, and we want to continue and support more conversations like that. Desiree, maybe I could go to you if thinking something about the, we're thinking about measures. Are there some pieces that you'd like to add from the equity thinking lens here that could contribute to a framework for science culture?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are a few concrete ways. I think we could think about this, framework that we're looking to possibly, shift or change. And I would say first, like building structural questions into the framework itself. So we do, as Susie mentioned early on, that, questions that address equity and structural barriers are not currently present. So structural questions, so we're not stopping at, who is participating. We're also asking questions like, who is setting the agenda? And I think Dan also is speaking to this as well, right? So who is setting the agenda for science education and engagement? Who is controlling the funding criteria and the evaluation metrics? So whose knowledge, right, and lived experiences are treated as legitimate evidence in this space? Because when we work with under-resourced communities, right, it's very obvious to us that science culture is not just about awareness or interest, right, in science. It's also about really who is getting to decide what counts as a science priority and whose realities are visible in these decisions. I would say also in thinking about this as well, I would also add that we treat equity as a design principle, right? And not a retrofit, which is sometimes what ends up happening.
Right.
So a new framework, I would say, could explicitly ask if we started from the needs and the strengths of communities who have been furthest away from opportunity, what would science culture look like? So that shifts our focus, right, in thinking about this one-size-fits-all approach. So it shifts our focus from how do we bring marginalized communities into existing programs to how do we design programs and policies that share power, resources, and decision-making with these communities. And Marianne just talked about it. So in our work, what that looks like is co-creating programs with youth and their families, and not just consulting them at the end. Hiring and supporting staff who are from the communities we serve, and also allowing time and resources for that relationship building. So not just these fast, countable outputs. And I would say also maybe changing what we measure. So if a framework only tracks things like interests or numbers of participants or attendance data, it will naturally reward, right, interventions that are short-term and superficial or surface level,
Yeah.
right? And so we need indicators that ask things like, do young people feel a sense of belonging and safety in science spaces? And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think this is important. Do they feel that they have agency, that they can use science, right, to address the issues that matter in their lives? And are
Mhm.
communities gaining more voice in decisions about research and innovation and policy, right, that affect them? So these are all questions about power, and it's not just
Mhm.
questions about presence. And in our context, right, the difference between doing these as one-offs and a long-term relationship in the communities is really night and day when it comes to these deeper outcomes. And I would say finally, and we talked a little bit about this, but making space for multiple ways of knowing, right? And
Mhm.
I see that as one of the questions that is already asked. So moving beyond inclusion, right? To recognizing that Western scientific institutions are one, right, powerful way of knowing, but not the only one, right? So a framework that values indigenous knowledges, local environment knowledge, and lived experiences alongside formal science, I think is inherently more equity oriented because it challenges that the idea that only one group's way of knowing are valid. So for me, like, a meaningful framework would be, not just tracking attendance data, how many people we're bringing into our existing ecosystems. It would really ask, are we redistributing voice, resources, legitimacy within that ecosystem so that communities who have been historically been on the margins can actually shape what science culture in Canada becomes.
Love it. You can see from the reactions there, Desiree, that there's enthusiastic support. People are asking for you to write a book, I believe, is what I'm looking for. No, but seriously, well, it's super powerful, and I love what you said, that this is these are questions about power, not just about presence. I wrote that down because I think that's extremely powerful, and we do often think about grab for the easiest things to measure, which is, and without seeing the power that's behind them. So that's super relevant. And I will also say that the co-creation aspect is something that we try to do in Actua, and get away from here's our kit of science, let's deliver it in your community, to what do you want to, what do you want to learn about? What do we want? How do we want to explore nature and science together? And what problems are you wanting to solve? And let's come up with a way to learn through those together. So I think that's a really important shift, actually, to make sure that gets captured in the next edition. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Susie, no big deal. We're just working on a few things here. Do you think we can? Do you think we can build a framework that's flexible, that centers equity, centers and thinks strongly about belonging and power and relationships and systems change, and still provide something that we can all refer to for national measures?
Yeah, this has been so interesting to listen to, and I think that one of the important things to keep in mind is that if you try to oversimplify this concept of science culture and kind of boil it down to a few indicators, you're kind of losing a lot of the important substance, right? And so yes, it's important to articulate what we're working towards. And yes, it's very helpful to measure the aspects of that lend themselves well to measurement. And it's also important to try to understand it in a whole bunch of other ways that don't boil down to indicators, right? And so it's really just thinking about what are the measures that are going to be meaningful, and then just that's sort of like the CCA's process with all of the messy questions that come to us. It's we're trying to sort of distill what is known about these issues, and make that accessible, but we're not trying to kind of eliminate all the complexity from it. We're trying to understand the complexity. And so I think that's what's called for here. And so, we'll have to bring in quantitative and qualitative evidence to get a meaningful picture and to point towards where we need to go, how we need to move forward.
I think it's really exciting. Dan, do you have any specific metrics or indicators that you've been thinking, or things that we could use if we were looking at this again?
I think so. I mean, I could really nerd out on this question, but I won't.
I only have a certain amount of time.
I won't. Yeah. So we did write the third of our 3 papers focuses on, questions of measurement. So rather than talking about specific measurements, let me just say 3 things that we're looking for, maybe, or 3 gaps or issues that we're dealing with when it comes to measurement of science culture. So I mean, in some cases, we know what we want to measure, and we've done so in the past. We just need more current data, right? And this is true of a lot of the CCA's indicators. We just, for a lot of those, it would really be helpful if we just had, new data from StatsCan, the OECD, maybe some custom surveys, right? A second category are things that, we think we know what to measure, but we haven't done so in the past, or we haven't done so especially well, right? So we need to start, right? And that, those are things like data to flesh out the distributional lens that we've been talking about, trying to pick up a picture of the institutional or structural health of the ecosystem, right? Like we know we need to do these things, but we haven't, and there are some decent ideas about how to do it, but we just haven't done it in any sort of meaningful, robust way. Then there's like the third category that are things that it's like we know they matter and we want to measure them in order to track progress, to inform, policies and programs that would empower people and improve science culture generally. We know they matter, we know we want to measure them, but we haven't quite figured out how to measure them yet. They're complicated things. I'll give you one example that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and you've heard this before, Tracy, but others haven't. We're pretty good at measuring, for example, whether or not an institution or a group of people, right? So we can ask people in society, do you trust scientists? Or, do you trust the health agency of a particular country, right? And we can get a pretty good answer to that question. What we're not really good at is understanding whether those institutions or groups of people are trustworthy, right? Which has become an increasingly difficult challenge when, certain institutions in certain countries are changing how they behave, right? Are generating things that might not be trustworthy. And so that, thinking about how to actually measure that kind of thing becomes much more difficult. So, I mean, there's a bunch of gaps. Some we know how to fill, and some we're still thinking about how to fill, but that's the short nerd answer.
Nope, that is super helpful and does on the trustworthiness. I think that it resonates with a lot of the pieces that Desiree and Marianne and others have been saying. So I am going to start bringing us together here. I'll see lots of good questions in the chat. So I am just going to be looking through those. Please ask your questions of the panel using the Q&A function. And then if you see one that resonates with your own thoughts, you can upvote that there. And I wonder if we could just do a final wrap up, 60 seconds from everyone on what would be a crucial next step for this discussion. Okay, we've got some things at the table about what we know, what we'd like to know. What would be the next step if you could just, push this rock a little bit further down the road? I think, Desiree, you've got your microphone open. Would you mind starting us off on this?
Yeah, I would say I would want this conversation to lead quickly to something very concrete. A co-designed science culture framework that is built with not just about the communities who've historically been furthest from STEM opportunity, I'd love to see us really take what we've surfaced today and work with, a few communities and organizations on the ground to pilot that framework in real context, and then use what we learn to reshape, right, funding criteria and metrics, right? So we're resourcing long-term relationship-based equity-oriented work rather than just short-term, like I said, accountable outputs. And I would also want to, center very quickly. I'd also want to center youth and caregivers, right, from equity deserving communities alongside, right, these community organizations. So teachers and Indigenous partners who work with them every day. And I would also want, funders and policymakers in the room with us today so that when these communities tell us what a just and inclusive science culture needs to look like, we're positioned to actually act on it, right? Not just admire the analysis.
Yeah, yeah, it's gotta actually work for a number of different folks in a different number of different spaces. So that's really helpful, Desiree. Thank you, and I appreciate the like, let's get something going. I think there's a comment referring to that in the questions as well, talking about past reports that have called for these things, but actual, moving to changing frameworks takes a while. So I appreciate that comment. Marianne, you're next on my little window here. Do you have some closing thoughts here to take us to the next step?
Yes, to what Desiree said.
What Desiree said. Great.
Let's be action oriented. Let's build a symposium. Let's use a co-creation model when we're doing this work. There's enough organizations now in this space and commitment to work collaboratively. I think you see that in this panel, and there's many more organizations who this conversation, is affected by science culture. So I think we could move quickly towards those ends. I think it's going to be critical to include the funders and researchers. I think someone else mentioned, like in the comments, this challenge in this time of government cuts. How can we be promoting something more that needs more money? And so there's this value understanding that's kind of needed, like they go hand in hand. If you want the public to support science, they need to be involved and engaged and understand, it's all hand in hand. And so this is a critical part of our research kind of ecosystem that needs to be there. So let's move quickly. Let's line something up and let's co-create.
Amazing. I heard symposium. Maybe. Dan and then Susie. Susie, I'll give you the last word. Dan, do you have any thoughts there on taking this to the next step?
Yeah, I mean, mine's pretty simple. From my perspective, a lot of the snapshots or pictures that we generate of how we're doing in science culture are so infrequent and ad hoc that I think it slips off the radar. Like both how we're doing and why it's important slips off the radar. So I'd like to see something that's more regular, something that's more predictable in terms of giving us a picture of, how we're doing and how, the tools or metrics of science culture are distributed across communities.
Right. Something nimble and flexible that we can do on a regular basis. Appreciate that. Susie, any thoughts here from what would be your next step?
Sure. Yeah, I think, just generally we see a lot of ongoing sort of sustained interest in this topic from the informal science learning sector, and less so from other groups that, play critical roles in shaping science culture in Canada, including, the K-12 education system, industry, media, different government policymakers. And so I really think, I'm just kind of building on what Desiree and Marianne said, but, bringing those groups into this conversation, as soon as possible is really important to make sure that whatever's landed on is really kind of has as much buy-in and is as helpful to as many different groups as possible.
It's a really good point. And appreciate that for sure. So we actually want to hear from the audience now. We have a bit of a poll as we turn to questions, or just before we turn to questions. We'd love to hear from folks in the audience here today. What would you prioritize? It's a short answer poll, and the CSPC folks will bring it up here. It is in English, but if you'd like to answer in French, please go ahead. And maybe this will help us collect some of the thoughts that you might have had as you've been hearing the panelists here today. And we'll leave that open for a minute and a half or so, and maybe look back at some of the answers when we get through some of the questions. So please feel free to answer that. And I will just go to some of the questions here, everyone, and take a look. The most upvoted question is, how can a science culture framework support and lift Indigenous knowledges and knowledge systems as critical knowledge to benefit communities with greater resilience, equity, and comprehensive evidence-based decision-making? I love that this is the most upvoted question and the most important question to our audience so far. Incredibly relevant, and we need to bring Indigenous voice into this conversation. It's essential, and should have had it here today. But that's that's on me. But I wonder if folks want to. We've talked about bringing in different ways of knowing. We've talked about, involving folks in co-creation. We've talked about systems change, relationships. Those are all really important to Indigenous ways of knowing as well. I take comment here on this, thinking about communities with resilience, equity, and comprehensive evidence-based decision-making. Does anyone want to make a comment to this particular question? Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. So the definition that we came up with, we've been quite conscious of this in our work on science culture at ACTUA. And, in addition to, doing our lit reviews, data reviews, and things like that, we would have discussions within the organization about how we should define science culture, what should be included. And this isn't obvious on a first read of the provisional definition that we came up with, but it is actually, richly informed by the knowledge and contributions of our InSTEM teams, our Indigenous STEM team at ACTUA. So, in that first phrase that we have in the definition, strong science culture values diverse norms, attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge systems, right? That is a placeholder for bringing in Indigenous knowledge. The phrase, in order to practice constant inquiry, that was literally introduced by our InSTEM team, right? So we hope that this reflects, our provisional definition reflects an attempt to begin to kind of capture this, but it's only a first step, right? Like, how you actually operationalize this is the really difficult work. And it's not the kind of work that you're going to get done through analysis. It's the kind of work that you get through discussion and working with people in communities, right? Which is I call it constructively messy, right? So it's not easily analytical logical. It's constructively messy. And so we're trying, I guess, maybe the short version of putting that.
No, thanks, Dan, for bringing that voice forward. Marianne?
Yeah, I was going to chime in. I think this is a great question. As we've been working more kind of in this middle space between like Western worldviews and Indigenous worldviews, I find we're constantly challenging ourselves to not be completely reductionist in our thinking. This is very common. I'm a Western trained scientist. This is what we do. We compartmentalize and break things into their components. And actually thinking at a systems level is this kind of a broader, holistic way of viewing a problem. And so we've learned a lot by being able to kind of step into this middle space. Some people say two-eyed seeing, where acknowledges both viewpoints, but really like the systems lens, and we're just so fortunate to be working with an Anishinaabe systems change scholar. But system change thinking in general is a kind of a helpful entry point, I think, for a lot of Western trained thinking folks. So that's why I would encourage, when we're thinking about a science culture framework, that it is also at this systems level, because I think that can allow different ways of knowing to be incorporated.
Thank you.
And-
That's relevant.
And
ahead,
I could
Desiree.
also briefly also chime in and also add to that.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about it at a systems level, I also think even at a maybe local or community level, I would say co-designing and co-governance with Indigenous nations. So where we're recognizing that Indigenous knowledge systems as essential evidence for knowledge systems, as essential evidence, sorry, for decisions, right, about land, health, and climate, and then also in this on the systems level, building in concrete levers, so funding rules, accountability structures, and protections that follow Indigenous leadership rather than just extracting knowledge from communities.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's so relevant.
That extractive nature is so second nature to how we conduct science, Western science. It's built in.
Yeah.
And it can absolutely be something that a framework does without even knowing that it's doing that, if you see what I mean. So these are essential points to pull in. There's another question here I want to get to, if that's okay. Oh, and I'm also going to say, I know the poll closed surprisingly, so I've asked the CSPC folks to see if we can reopen it. So we will be looking into that. There's a question here that's been upvoted a lot, which I think is super interesting. It says, how can we continue to support a science culture as public funding for science and healthcare and public service in general is declining? I can't fact check that on the go here exactly, so I'll just put that caveat out there. We know I have seen a lot of it happening south of the border, and that is well documented. I just don't have the evidence here to speak to what's happening here in Canada, but I think it's a relevant question. There's increasingly pressures on budgets in science. There's increase with more and more science issues. There's more and more applied questions and grand challenges that need to be tackled. How do we make decisions about what we spend on science culture, which ultimately would, a science culture framework would help guide funding decisions. There's no question about it, hopefully. So does anyone want to comment to dealing with that kind of uncertainty and changes in the funding landscape?
I'd be happy to start.
Thanks, Susie.
Yeah, I think I would just say that we need to understand what we are working towards. So we need to understand collectively what is science culture. And so then we can say from there, how are we measuring up, and, qualitatively, how are we doing? And then that can inform kind of more efficient use of scarce resources, right? So if we have a clear sense of what we're working towards, and there's more consent working towards, then it could be easier to be clear about where resources are most needed.
Yep, that's super helpful. Anyone else have a thought there? Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, it's a tough question, right? Because governments will be thinking about what to prioritize and where to allocate resources. And I think, part of the conversation about science culture has to be reminding ourselves and others why science culture itself is important, right? And linking it to the kinds of things that are priorities in for governments and for society, right? So I mean,
Mhm.
in our papers and in my opening remarks, I said, look, we care about science culture because it is a key variable, a key mechanism for achieving things like innovation and prosperity, for not only generating health science, but enabling people to use it effectively. So, we want a strong science culture in order to achieve these things that, we really care about and other people care about, so that hopefully people begin to see that science culture is not a nice to have, it's actually a necessary to have. It's actually how you operationalize your investments in a lot of these other areas, or how you get that return on investment.
Mhm. Yeah, we
I,
definitely. Yeah, go ahead, Marianne.
yeah, what they said. I think there's also a shift that can be made. We often talk about shifting from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And again, I know I kind of keep saying this interconnectivity piece, but there is limited funding, but it doesn't mean there's limited resources. And I think finding the opportunities of connection between organizations and sectors that bring everybody's boats up, or like the win-wins, we can get a lot done. And so we don't need to be waiting, or compete. Like, I mean, I know we all compete for funds, but like there's other resources that we can be sharing and collaborating across. And so I think there's a shift that we can make in that mindset that will help. That as another piece.
Thank you. That's super helpful. There's two questions here that I'm going to combine, and they have to do with international aspects of what we're talking about. The one question, the first question, and sorry, I've lost it. It's about UK. It was asking about, okay, what can we learn from other countries' science culture frameworks? For example, the UK has been considering matters like science capital and how it impacts not only but also the calling towards science of underrepresented groups. What lessons can we take from their vision and how they can be adapted or applied to Canada's own specificities? So that seems like it's a question specifically about science capital and science capital in the UK, but I'm going to use it to ask about any more connections to international movements. So you can answer those two. And then on the flip side, so that's taking from learning from others. On the flip side, and there's another question here that says, what lessons can small developing countries learn from how Canada conducted research into science culture and how it is approaching the development of this framework? So are there areas where Canada can be leading and sharing in this work? So, Marianne, maybe I'll ask you first, just to briefly sort of get us back into that international thinking mindset, and then pass it to anybody else who wants to take the mic.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I'm putting in the chat, I'm just sharing an article that came out last year that's looking toward like moving in this step towards comparing, in this context, science communication ecosystems, but it's acknowledging that kind of the setup across different countries is different. Some countries have legislation that includes science communication. Canada does not. Some countries are more market driven, economic driven in their approach to kind of science communication. Maybe we replace it with science culture. So I think understanding what we're comparing is important, and maybe at the first onset, kind of compare to like countries could be a helpful way of doing it. Can we learn from some other models that are different from us? Absolutely. Can we learn from countries that have a legislated aspect to their kind of research around public science engagement? Yeah. Should we work towards that? I would say yes. In Canada, I think there's a lot of benefits there. So I'll just put that paper as reference. I can speak to the science capital framework out of the UK, which I think I know the Ontario Science Centre has been working with those folks and kind of even adapting the language, going back to language. Science capital sounds very extractive. And so even just thinking about what we call it, being more inclusive, calling it STEM equity, that framework is kind of describes the relationship of science in someone's life through all of these elements. So very kind of similar to science culture. When I came across it, I was like, oh, this is the framework for science culture. But it doesn't come in with like, here's what to measure. Here, you know, it's a concept, kind of like a tool of let's talk about this. And the work to be done is towards this kind of, if we want to do common measurement. I did want to bring up something that I forgot earlier because I saw it in the comments around storytelling. Because I think this is another critical aspect when we talk about other ways of knowing, worldviews, indigenous knowledge, and storytelling as also a way of understanding what's going on. And it is a very valid research mechanism that can be really helpful in the work we're doing. And that's more qualitative in its nature, but there are ways we can set up kind of measurements that incorporate storytelling.
That's helpful. Thank you. Does anyone else have thoughts on the international aspect of this where we sit in this work? No? Okay. That gives us time for another. We will be wrapping up in just a couple minutes, but I thought there was an interesting one here that I do want to address. Okay, it is, how may this framework consider the impact of various sectors' promotion and contextualization of science in Canada's cultural zeitgeist and the strategic potential of activities like, and this is where I think the meat is, government knowledge mobilization, science communication. So, you know, other terms that connect with transfer of science or talking about transfer of knowledge. And I might add to that, thinking about tech culture and digital sphere, and increasingly around AI. I don't know if anyone wants to take that because it's a very big question. But I just want to put out there the conversation about terms, right? We talk about innovation culture, interchangeable with science culture. Is it really? And thinking and knowledge mobilization, what would be different about that than science culture? Just want to say, I know, Dan, we've wrestled with these a lot within ACTUA, because the term science culture it can be thought of in many different ways. So it's not really an answer. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to how the framework would deal with different frameworks or different pieces.
I'm certainly not going to attempt to answer, but I would, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to just kind of underscore one point that didn't get a lot of discussion so far today around the role of mis and disinformation in shaping and influencing science culture. I think it's a really important connection, and is one of the ways in which the old assessment feels the most dated, is just, you know, how the ways that people access information, it's just become so much more complicated. And so figuring out how that fits into this framework, I do not have an answer, but it's a pretty important question.
Thank you. I agree. I think that, thanks for getting that in there right at the end. I'm going to wrap things up just on the poll. We can show the responses that we have. We got a few responses, and folks from CSPC, if we have a second to just put those up, we can do that. And then I don't know if we'll have time to open it up again, but apologies for the quick closure there. And I just want to thank everyone for coming and very much appreciate all of the panelists' comments and contributions to this. I think it was incredibly powerful. And I don't know about you, but I'm all charged up for the next iteration, next conversation of where this goes. And I will pass it back over to the CSPC team for closing comments.
Thanks everyone for joining this session. We have shared the poll results on the chat. Because it's a short answer, we can't share it directly. It is posted in the chat. And thanks again for wonderful turnout and great conversation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think there's also a feedback poll here now that's just been launched. So if you have any thoughts on this session, we'd love to get your feedback on that. It says here, hosts and panelists cannot vote. Darn, I was planning to. And then I think that's it. Thanks very much.